Hello and welcome to the EMJ Podcast with me, your host, Dr. Jonathan Sakia. Today I'm joined by Dr. Haider Warraich, a clinician scientist specializing in cardiology, advanced heart failure, and transplantation. He serves in multiple capacities across prestigious institutions. At the Veterans Administration, the VA Boston healthcare system, he holds the role of Associate Director of Heart Failure and leads the Advanced Heart Failure Program. Simultaneously, at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, a very well known institution that I've had the privilege of working with, he works as an associate physician overseeing advanced heart failure and transplantation services while coordinating fellowship programs. His contributions extend beyond clinical practice. He's a prolific writer with notable works like Modern Death and State of the Heart, which have gathered acclaim and translation into multiple languages. And we're going to be getting into that. Excuse me. His expertise has earned him coverage in prominent media outlets and appearances on platforms like National Public Radio and CNN. He's authored more than 150 peer reviewed papers, writes frequently for the New York Times, among others. Following medical school at the Aga Khan University in Pakistan, he pursued his residency at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, also in Boston, before moving to Duke University Medical Center for cardiology training. He returned to Boston in 2019 and assumed leadership roles at the VA and Brigham, alongside teaching at Harvard Medical School, another reasonably well-known institution. His journey continued with an appointment at the FDA as Senior Clinical Advisor for Chronic Disease, where he influences policy across various domains, including drugs, devices, and nutrition. He's a big fan of the Pakistani cricket team, which he states is quite an emotional roller coaster. And we were talking before we got going that that's the fate of every sports fan. He also wrote fiction and before moving to nonfiction, and he in fact published a novel in medical school. He loves playing video games and nowadays devotes his time to playing with his 8-year-old daughter. I wonder who wins. So, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Haider Warraich. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Jonathan, it's just great to be here. Thank you so much for the kind and warm introduction, and really excited to share thoughts and sort of my journey with you and with your listeners.
Fantastic. I really appreciate it. I really think that we are very privileged to work as doctors, and I love meeting people. I started doing this during the COVID pandemic as a way of, welcoming colleagues into my home for interesting conversations. And there are so many Renaissance characters, and you're clearly one of them. So I love an origin story. Firstly, tell us about your journey into medicine and how you ended up in cardiology.
Well, I grew up in Pakistan, and I really was, I would say, fairly pluripotent. I was interested in a whole host of different things. Including engineering, medicine, obviously, and then my mom was a dentist, so that was always something that piqued my interest. But I think what was unique about medicine for me was really how connected it was to to our place as human beings in this world, and how connected storytelling and narrative is to the practice of medicine. I always felt like I was drawn to storytelling. I was doodling comic books and writing short stories back when I was in high school. And I felt in some ways that medicine was a natural extension of that type of exploration. And for a while, things didn't really come together because I think when you start off in medicine, and so that took me to the Aga Khan Medical College in Pakistan, which is a really wonderful place for a medical education, and it was a very stimulating environment. I met people. There's almost no chance I would have ever met under any other circumstance. I got to grow a lot and learn a lot about myself. But initially the writing was if anything, was pulling me away from medicine, in part because it takes a while to really know what it's like to be a physician. It takes a while to just learn the language, to learn the rituals and customs, and to feel like you're part of, you're part of the flow of things, rather than as a medical student who's kind of clinging on, as this kind of train speeds forward. So it took me a while for to just get deeper and deeper into medicine, to a point where I then could actually write about medicine rather than write about things outside of medicine. And that really, I think, pulled things together for me, and really made me feel whole, rather than someone who is discombobulated, who's always looking outside for inspiration. And when things came together, I realized that I just have to show up to work, right? That's all I have to do, to find these amazing stories, that I now have had the privilege to tell, so many others.
Absolutely. So let's dig into your specialty a bit. Talk to us about heart failure in 2024. What are the most inspiring developments over the past 5 years or so, and what promise does the future hold?
So, what it's heart failure is one of those specialties within cardiology that have, I would say, transformed even over a very brief period of time. Ever since I started training, I have seen things that would have easily been discounted as science fiction when I started. I started residency around in 2000 in 2010, and it was around that time that there was a new sort of unit was created in our hospital, for patients who were getting a type of therapy that residents were, in fact, at the start, at least, we weren't even allowed to be part of those teams. And that therapy was left ventricular assist devices. This is around the time when um, LVADs started to get approval as destination therapies, which is to say that before that, LVAD technology was really as a bridge for a patient who was too sick, uh, to have gotten a heart transplant or some type of other therapy at that moment, but needed something to get them to it. But the technology had been coming forward in leaps and bounds, and had really reached a point where people could live with this technology. People could live with an artificial pump that's pumping blood from their left ventricle, which is the pumping chamber of the heart, to their entire body, and they can go home with it. They can, and to a great extent, and for many patients, they were able to resume activities that there was no way that they would have been able to do before. And these patients don't have a pulse. Oftentimes you can, doing CPR on them can do more harm than good. They really sort of changed our understanding of what it means to be a human being. And so to see that technology really sort of flourish, even during my own sort of starting from my training and now to my career, um, has been nothing short of astounding. In addition, we've had so many advances in medical therapy, and so both, we obviously have medications such as SGLT2 inhibitors, that really kind of came out of the blue, and were represent one of the great epiphanies in medicine, one of the great, sometimes it's just good to be lucky. And I think that just now having those medicines as an additional tool in our toolkit has really, I think, changed the practice of heart failure. The reason heart failure was called heart failure was because when you got it, you basically, your heart failed and you died. Mortality rates of heart failure were, upwards of 50%. Once you developed heart failure, you were really sort of at the very end of life. And what we've done is that we've transformed heart failure into a chronic disease that people can live with for a really, really long time. And that's nothing short of remarkable. At the same time, I think we've seen that with a lot of other things in cardiology too, where cardiology used to be the sort of specialty in which people had conditions that had a very binary outcome, that you either lived, or you died pretty quickly. This is true of heart attacks. This is true of cardiogenic shock. This is true of ventricular arrhythmias. And now with our therapies, what we've done is that we've turned most advanced heart disease into a chronic disease, into a disease that people live with for a long period of time. And that's allowed people to live into longer ages, have milestones that they would have never even dreamt of. And I think that now one of the most exciting things in the field of heart failure is now so we've had all these interventions or technological advances that when you already have advanced disease, but now we're seeing things like cell-based therapies and gene therapies that could potentially cure conditions like inherited cardiomyopathies like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or ARVC. I mean, these are things that are very much being are that look extremely promising. And so our field as is has transformed, and I foresee it transforming even more as we learn more about the heart and we develop these new therapies that I must say that we couldn't even have imagined when I first started.
Yeah. So thank you for that oversight. What's the overview rather? What's the um, median survival now from diagnosis of heart failure?
It's an interesting question because it's such a moving target. I think one of the things one of the interesting studies that I look to just give an estimate. It doesn't give you a sense of what the median survival of heart failure is, but can give you a sense of how much better our therapies are. There's an analysis in the Lancet by a good friend of mine who's here at the Brigham, Muthu Vadugunathan, and what he showed was that for a patient with heart failure, and I believe is around people around the age of 55, that if patients who have heart failure are provided just some medical therapy that's evidence based, so pills essentially, and if patients just take those pills versus patients who don't, taking those pills adds about 8 years of life, additional on top of what people would live for anyways. So it used to be a condition that people would live for months, but I think that at this point, I think it's fair to say that a lot of people, again, depending on when you have heart failure or what type of circumstance you're in, can live a long period of time. I would say, if anything, especially in older patients, it's not really the heart failure that's limiting, but it's actually the comorbidities that often heart failure finds itself in. In a heart failure, especially, you have, I would say that you have two sort of broad types of heart failure. You have these cardiomyopathies in which patients will have either dilated cardiomyopathy, postpartum cardiomyopathy, or inherited cardiomyopathy, in which the heart failure is a primary disease, is the only condition, and these patients are otherwise fairly healthy. And so these are patients who are often excellent transplants candidates for heart transplantation or left ventricular assist devices. But the majority of people that we're seeing with heart failure, the vast majority, are basically those who have multiple comorbidities: diabetes, obesity, sleep apnea, chronic kidney disease, atrial fibrillation, COPD, pulmonary hypertension, etc. And heart failure is one piece of those. I think of heart failure kind of as a yeah, I'm still working on the good metaphor. You mentioned that I play video games, and I kind of think of if you play video games, at the end of every level, there's like this boss that you have to beat. But at the end of the game, there's like this ultimate boss, and I feel like every boss is essentially a chronic disease, and heart failure is like all these chronic disease put together. That's really at the end, because it really feels like it is a magnet for chronic comorbidity. So I think right now, if I think about what is limiting further improvements in lifespan for a lot of our patients with heart failure, oftentimes it's just getting the right therapies to the patients who need them, making sure that they're getting evidence-based therapies, making sure patients can afford the medications that they're being prescribed, making sure that they're adhering to those medications and taking those medications as to the benefit of their health and well-being. But at the same time, I think the other big limiting factor is the fact that if we don't make progress around all these other conditions that heart failure lives within, usually, that is really, I think, one of the biggest steps that is preventing us from making even greater progress.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you for a similar update on heart transplantation from Christian Barnard's pioneering work in 1967, I believe it was, to where we are now: stem cells, cardiac assist devices, which you've mentioned, LVADs, implantables. Where are we? What's the state of play?
So heart transplantation remains. I work clinically at Brigham and Women's on the heart transplant and LVAD services, and it to date remains one of the most dramatic therapies known to mankind. You take someone who is dying essentially, and if they get a heart transplant, they basically you cured their heart failure, which is unbelievable, and really life changing. Christian Bernard, the South African surgeon who performed the first transplant. He's an interesting character in our field because even though he was the first, I think it is very clear that his that was the most important thing for him, to be the first to do it rather than to be the best to do it. And it was really others after him, so other surgeons and physicians who really work very hard to make sure that we overcome the many, 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 many challenges that arise for patients after the heart transplant. The surgery is just, I would say, that is an important piece, but it is just one piece in the journey of a patient with heart transplantation, and many of the challenges happen afterwards. So, we made a lot of progress in a few, certain domains. So, for example, we're very good at immunosuppression is better. People, we don't have, or it's rare for us to see the sort of catastrophic rejection anymore because of systems we've developed, the therapies we have, the protocols we have, etc. But I think it has to be said that in some ways, heart transplantation has stagnated a little bit. Survival from heart transplantation has not, increased initially as we sort of got better. But I would say for the most part has plateaued. We've had some innovations in the heart transplant field, more so with regards to just expanding the donor pool. So we, for example, we used to people who die of opioid overdoses. We would often not take hearts from them. There's this thought that these donors may not do well, but data that we published and others have published have shown that in fact there's no difference. And this was really critical because the United States and was in the middle, or still I guess is in the middle of an opioid epidemic, and so that has really allowed us to find some kernel of good in this epidemic, which is that even though we have so many young people dying of opioids, and it's a real tragedy, some of them end up becoming organ donors and help recipients live long, healthy lives afterwards. We've gotten better at procurement devices, so being able to get hearts from far, far away, and making sure that they stay well in their as they make it to the center where the recipient is. Hepatitis C. We now frequently take transplants organs from patients who have hepatitis C, but because of advances in medical therapy for hepatitis C, we can give these therapies to the recipient, and there's no difference in outcomes, and we can essentially cure the Hep C. So we've made tons of progress in essentially ensuring that we are, really sort of trying to maximize the donor pool. But if you look at lifespan or lifespan of the organ itself, that is, I think, where we still need to do more. Speaking as a clinician, I think as a heart failure clinician, you have this one space of the general heart failure where you have a lot of evidence around medical therapies and devices such as ICDs or CRTs. But in the transplant world, we don't have that sort of strong body of evidence, in part because we don't have those collaborative trials that we need to be able to keep generating new knowledge that's going to improve our practice. Transplant programs, don't, often will, they do things that way because that's how they've done. The stakes are very high, the denominator is small, so there's a lot of risk aversion to innovation. So that is, I think, one place that I think that we can do better at. The most exciting thing to happen in the transplant world has really been xenotransplantation, which we've seen there. There has been one or there has been some instances of xenotransplantation for both kidneys and hearts in the United States, which is, I would say it's a very, very exciting field. They were organs basically taken from animals who had edited out genes that would make them at high risk for rejection. But that field is still nascent, but it is incredibly exciting because then it obviates the need. Because so many of our struggles are related to the lack of good
Donor.
donors, and if we
Yeah,
can obviate that, that would be exciting.
yeah, absolutely. These sort of innovations require technology. They require devices, drugs, as you've mentioned. And one element of bringing those innovations to the bedside is the regulatory environment. We have to do clinical work and we have to have things regulated, cleared, approved. And I'd love to touch briefly on your role as Senior Clinical Advisor for Chronic Diseases at FDA. Your website states, I'm just going to read this, that you work closely with FDA leadership, its centers, other federal agencies, and various stakeholders to shape policy across drugs, devices, nutrition, wow, and AI as it pertains to chronic disease. Tell us what attracted you to getting involved in that role, because regulatory medicine is so very different from clinical trial medicine, which is different again from clinical practice. You can make a brief comment about what attracted you to the role and maybe also about how regulatory medicine is changing to address these needs.
So, I mean, I think I've always been. I think the ability to sort of as physicians, our mission. There's this one mission we have at the bedside for every patient, but I also feel like we have a greater mission, which is a public health oriented mission. And growing up in Pakistan, where you saw the limits of you know that you could be the best physician at the bedside of your patient, and yet there's so much left on the table. There's so much preventable suffering that was ongoing, and so so I've always been drawn to um, having a to bringing that bedside perspective and that sort of patient oriented perspective into sort of public health. And so that was so when, and I've always been focused on chronic disease. I think that represents a huge challenge to, I think, not just societies here, but around the world. Many even developing countries have this kind of what's called the double burden, where they have diseases of yesteryear, so to speak, tuberculosis, malaria, dengue, etc. But now also have this huge burgeoning epidemic, if you may, of chronic conditions. So those were some of the things that attracted me to this role. It's been a real sort of pleasure and honor to work at FDA. And I do think that there is. I think physicians, clinicians, really need to engage more with regulatory bodies to be able to provide clinical context, to be able to provide that patient perspective, which is so important, really, in whatever we do. So yeah, so that's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah. And I do know that the regulators, obviously, they can't move at the speed that clinical medicine moves at. I've flown aeroplanes as an avocation and got
Mm.
involved in aeromedicine. And other pilots would write to me complaining about how in America, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, hadn't taken some medical innovation, clasped it to its bosom and accepted it. And I tried to explain, yeah, it's gone through a clinical trial that meets that boundary, but FAA now wants to see how it performs in a broader population before they legislate on it. And, I think we all need to realize that these bodies exist to to protect the broader population and to ensure that good quality medicine is practiced. So, changing topic a little bit, you're a prolific author, and I want to deal with some of your amazing writing. A number of years ago, Hedda, I was the host of a TV show in America, and we would have guests on, and one of the guests was Sherwin Newland, who'd written a book all about how we die. It was an incredibly well written book, tough read, but a good book. And you've continued that tradition, published a clever and fascinating book entitled Modern Death: how medicine changed the end of life. Talk to us a bit about your motivation for that book and share some of the rituals associated with death that fascinated you, an example or two from the book. View this as an opportunity, if you will, to sell modern death to our audience. And we will put links to this and the others to come in the show notes so people can find them.
So I think one of the things I was surprised with, and one of the things when I transitioned from being a medical student to now being an intern and resident in internal medicine, was that, oftentimes medical students are sheltered from end of life. They're sheltered from some of these aspects of what we do, that there's a sense that, maybe medical students aren't ready for it. Maybe we should, maybe this might be too heavy of an experience for them to handle. And yet, when you think about what it's like to be an intern or resident, it almost felt like all of that burden then falls on you, because, essentially, especially in those critical moments, oftentimes off hours, you are the first person to come to a code, and you may be the last person to leave as you're telling the family or signing the death certificate. And it really was something that defined my training, and I think the training of so many other people, regardless, I think, of what specialty you practice. That dealing with patients at the end of life was a central part of what I did. But unlike other parts, such as, for example, how to take care of a heart attack or how to take care of pneumonia, I felt that I didn't know enough about why we were doing things the way we were doing that way. Part of it was I'd grown up in Pakistan, I'd seen this different world. And so when I came to the United States and to learn about advanced directives and code status and having these discussions around life-sustaining therapies, such as mechanical ventilation, or hemodialysis, etc., were so foreign to me, that first they evoked this emotional response, and my response to that was really to put things down to paper. I began to write, and that's really what, to me, opened my eyes to what we was doing. I talked initially about how I had this that I didn't really understand medicine. I didn't really write about medicine, but it really began with my experiences at the end of life when I was a resident. And I started sharing those stories. I wrote a couple of articles for the New York Times. I wrote this article. The first article I wrote was called "The Cancer of Optimism," and it was and the idea was, how do I so much of what I was hearing or reading about what people are saying in outside of the walls of the hospital about what it was like to be sick and what it was like to die in modern times was so different from what I was seeing. And I really wanted to present that perspective. I wanted to make sure that when people were in that situation, they felt like they were equipped with knowledge, and they were, because it can be so scary and so paralyzing. So I continued to write articles, and then eventually realized that this story was too big to be contained in, a 1,200 word essay. And so I ended up writing a book which really charted the history of how we die, and and really sort of tracing why we do things the way we do today, how they came to be, and what they might look like in the future. I was always drawn to some of these rituals around the end of life, and I wrote an article for the New York Times, titled "The Rituals of Modern Death," and sometimes you have to find the humor in all of it. So one of the things that would happen in where I was a resident, when patients were close to the end of life, or they were getting sort of comfort measures, and death was imminent, oftentimes the nurses would bring in this cart of cookies from the cafeteria. And if you're a resident, you're running around, you may not have had anything to eat, so just looking at those cookies are very enticing cookies. So I went up to one of the trays and I picked up this chocolate cookie. It was outside the patient's room, and a nurse, immediately she stopped me. She said, "Don't have that cookie." Well, I said, "Well, why not?" She said, "Oh, it's bad luck. It's a death cookie." And it really sort of stuck with me, that moment, because it was so, that I realized that I'd stepped into this culture that I had no idea about. There's this other thing that the nurses would often do. We have, in most patient rooms, will have a television, just to make the moments go by. Um, and for a lot of patients who are at end of life, or patients who had dementia, or couldn't speak or really hear, to just fill the gap, so to speak, there was this channel called the Care Channel, which was this channel which had these like, slow moving pictures and music, and it was very relaxing. But in juxtaposed with what the context of putting that channel on, it really created this sort of cognitive dissonance, and that was very very much something that I couldn't really sort of put together in a meaningful way. So it was, and then there are the more bureaucratic aspects of death, which the residents have to do. That we have to do the examination, we have to look for reflexes, we have to sign these forms, and which seems so at such odds with the profoundness of the moment that we're in. That someone's life has just gone away, um, and sometimes it can be a moment of tragedy. Many times it is, but sometimes there can be beauty and humanity in that moment. And yet we, as the house staff, are having to check off these boxes on a checklist, to call this person, call the primary care physician, call the morgue, or call the death examiner, ask for an autopsy. And it felt that it was that paperwork, that bureaucracy was taking away from my ability to be present for the family. For So yeah, I mean, that's what we've done with death, is that we have, for a lot of people, we've taken the soul of death, the meaningfulness of that experience away, and sort of sterilized it in a way, and sort of buried it in jargon and bureaucracy, and which I think is a real disservice. I think giving us physicians, clinicians, nurses space to be human beings in those moments would, I think, go a long way for the families, and also for the memory of the patient who has passed away.
And especially with modern medicine, where so much effort is expended to extend life, and when there's an inevitability of death. And I just recall when my mother was in the terminal stages of her life, and before her, my father, and experiencing it as a son primarily. And in the back of the mind, I'm a doctor, but I was trying to be there as a son, and I saw it through a completely different optic. And I don't know about you, but they didn't prepare me for it at medical school. The first time I talked to someone about death was when someone died when I was an intern, and I
Mhm.
was charged with being the one to go and speak to the family. And I'm on my way to go and speak to the family. This little old lady who'd collapsed and succumbed to a myocardial infarction. She was aged, and the family was sitting in the room. And as I walked into the room, it was like, I have no idea what I'm going to say. No one has prepared me for this. So, essential reading, we'll put the name in the show notes. And just as I asked you about heart transplantation, heart failure, next up, your book, State of the Heart. Entice our listeners to extend their visit to Amazon and fill up that shopping cart. Tell us about that book.
Yeah, well, I mean, cardio. I mean, all of medicine is just, what we've seen. I don't even think that we understand what we're living through. To be perfectly honest, the advances. And one example I give is that the human lifespan doubled since the middle of the 19th, since between the 1850s to now. We used to live, or even the start of the 20th century, the average lifespan was 40, and now it's 80. So within 150 years, we've doubled our lifespan. Before that, to double our lifespan from 20 to 40, it took us more than 200,000 years. And so there's this really interesting experiment. We all talk about longevity. Um, the lifespan extension that we've seen as human beings has never been replicated in a lab, or for in an animal model, or for anything like that. So what we've been able to accomplish, all of us together, to whatever, in one way or another, has been truly unprecedented. And I don't think that we've even realized what that has meant, and how, what a time that we live in. And I think within that, I've always been fascinated by cardiology, because I think in some ways cardiology, because it was the leading cause of death and because it was the leading cause of disability, and to this day it still remains so, it has been the focus of so much scientific progress, and so much technological progress. But it also drew all these really, really interesting people to it. Um, I and so when I was a cardiology fellow, that was 4 years of just being immersed in cardiovascular medicine. I was learning to be a cardiologist, but again, I was focused on, well, on the stories behind the stories behind, how did we, the story of, transplantation is amazing. How can we tell the stories of people who are getting transplants, and to give, words to numbers, to bring people into my life as a cardiologist and the lives of so many other cardiologists and physicians, but then also, how to create, even for us as cardiologists, to know where we are, like how did we get here, who were the key people who were involved, but what did it take for them, what are the sacrifices they make, what were these moments of ingenuity, what were these and what and what made these innovators really, really special, in so many different ways. There's so many different ways of being smart, right? There's so many different ways of being an innovator or being a genius, and I think that our field, starting with, William Harvey, who discovered circulation, who was, I would say, one of the most influential people in the history of mankind, because he made science a thing. He made experimentation and observation a thing, that was what you used to reach conclusions rather than what you were told or what you learned. Um, and so to be able to tell the stories of science and medicine and the people behind them and the people living with those conditions, um, was really, really special for me, for it to do. It almost felt like an obligation to do it. That there was just no way that I can't not write about what I had the privilege of seeing, and doing. And so it was a lot of fun. And especially now when we think about science and we see, this was right before the pandemic, and what we've seen with the pandemic is that, it's not just that that people don't realize the scientific process. They don't understand. Many people don't understand just what it took for us to be where we are. And so to be able to, and many people would rather, believe something that they've been told without going back to the data or without asking the right questions. And so to be able to sort of chart that journey, um, of scientific discovery, of empiricism, um, I mean, it was just an unbelievable, opportunity. And, it made me a better physician. It made me a better cardiologist, because I was so observant. I was paying attention to things I would have never paid attention to. I was connecting with people, and I was asking questions that I wouldn't have if my focus was just on figuring out the hemodynamics, or, what's the EKG. Obviously, those things are incredibly important. Um, but to have that additional layer, um, to and do it in an unbelievable environment. I was a fellow at Duke, which is a great, phenomenal institution, which is, changing the face of cardiology as we speak. So that was a real, privilege for me to be able to tell those stories, and then think about where we're headed. Um, how do we get the, because to me, I think cardiology, has created this interesting dilemma, which I think every other field would love to be in, where the next big thing in cardiovascular medicine is already here, right? So if, for so many other diseases like, ALS, or, these inherited conditions or rare diseases, there's always this sort of sense of, oh, if only we can find this cure, if only we can find this treatment. Well, in cardiology, we kind of did that, and yet still we're having such a difficult problem in getting people those treatments, in making sure that our innovations are actually having an impact on the population in the United States. um, Cardiovascular mortality has actually been going up these last few years. Heart failure mortality has been going up these last few years, despite all these innovations. And that's really sort of the core, question that I leave readers with, at the end, is how do we figure that problem out?
Well, I'm sure you're going to be at the forefront of figuring it out. But again, very eloquently said. And there's a third leg to this particular stool. So I'm sure the listeners would love to hear about your most recent book, brilliantly titled The Song of Our Scars, The Untold Story of Pain. I've yet to read it. Um, uh, just want to declare that. One of the books that I read at med school that still is on my bookshelf, The Puzzle of Pain by Melzack and Wall. And give us some teasers and why people should not leave the Amazon store just yet until they can, get all three. So tell us something about the story of the Song of Our Scars, the story of pain.
The first question people ask me about the book is, well, you're a cardiologist, well, why are you writing about pain? And truly, the main reason I wrote this book about pain was because I'd had this really bad back injury in medical school and lived with chronic pain for a long period of time. Um, I will say I have some reservations about physicians and clinicians only writing about things after they've experienced them. I feel like that shouldn't be a prerequisite for us to be able to understand what it is like for people to undergo these experiences. But I think pain is just one of those things, especially chronic pain is one of those things where there really is a sense that unless you experience it, and I've felt it myself, is that unless you live with pain all the time, that is relentless, that is never ending, that is the first thing that wakes you up and the last thing you remember when you fall to sleep, it's very hard to understand what life with chronic pain is like. On the other hand, I'd come to the United States from at the peak of the opioid prescription epidemic, where and that was something that was very very foreign to me. It was a very uniquely American thing at that time, where we were giving opioids at a rate that is unprecedented in the entire history of medicine. And lastly, the science of chronic, the one thing that, and as I got interested and I started looking into it more, what I realized was that the science of chronic pain was telling me something very, very different from how we were treating it. There's this huge gulf between a very, very interesting, well-developed science of chronic pain, and yet the treatment felt so primitive. I'll give you a small example. Um, One of the way we define chronic pain is that we say that it's pain that lasts for acute pain that lasts for 3 to 6 months on most days, and so the idea that I think we've all been sort of learned is that chronic pain is acute pain prolonged, and that has led to sort of this idea that, well, something that works for acute pain is going to work for chronic pain, and yet the science could not be more definitive that even though acute and chronic pain both hurt, they're actually very different phenomena. In fact, the severity of the initial injury has no bearing on whether you develop chronic pain or not. And if you look at the parts of the brain that are involved with the experience of acute and chronic pain, they're actually fairly different. Chronic pain actually is much more so of an emotion that your body remembers. It is more so of a trauma that is memorialized in your body, rather than simply nociceptive signals, coming from downstairs bombarding your brain, creating this experience of pain. And then the other thing about pain is that pain is very tied to power. Pain, whose pain we consider, whose pain do we respond to, is really depends on what their station, so to speak, in our hierarchy is. If you look at how we've treated the pain of people who were enslaved, if you look at the history of how we've treated the pain of childbirth, um, how we continue to see great disparities in how pain is treated. There's one study that I think to me is just it's insane. There was this one study of children who had acute appendicitis. A million children presenting to the emergency room with CT scan confirmed appendicitis, and what the researchers showed was that the odds of a black child receiving an opioid for CT scan confirmed pain was 20% that of a white child,
Gee.
even when you controlled for pain. And even though we know that, at least in the United States, misuse of opioids is actually much higher in white Americans, or was at that period of time. And so I found that there's all these things that were coming together. There's this personal aspect, there's this historical aspect. The science was unbelievable and really needed to be translated into in a way that people could understand and wrap their minds around. So that was the journey of the Song for Our Scars. It was a personal journey. It was the most personal book I've written. But really, and I was also, it was a book that I was really had was worried about how it would be received, because so many people feel that pain is so personal that, but I think for I received such great feedback, especially from people living with pain, that it's really been very gratifying for me to see.
Yeah. Well, I'll get back to you once I have read it. And um, why shouldn't a cardiologist write about it? Or if you get it, I could get very politically incorrect here and say, should men not write about childbirth? Should women not write about in medicine about prostate disease? So sadly, we're running out of time. So we're going to finish with a question that I like to ask every guest that comes on here. If a magical genie could grant you 3 wishes in your area, or frankly, any area of healthcare, what would your wishes be, Haider?
Um, I think universal access to treatments would be to evidence-based treatments and appropriate treatments. I think that is something that could really sort of transform how um, we practice medicine, and what we can get out of this stuff that we've already discovered. Um, I think the second wish is, a lot of people are scared of AI, especially physicians and clinicians, and um, I think I would love for a world in which AI helps us be better physicians. It helps us diagnose disease better. It helps us do documentation more seamlessly. It takes away all the stuff that is in some ways a distraction from the real art of medicine, which is sitting down to a patient and talking to them and being there with them, because that's something that a machine or AI can never do. And so I would love to sort of have a world in which um, that the potential of AI does not get hijacked by financial interests, and that it creates space for us to be human with our patients. Um, and the third thing is that I hope that we all learn to see every human being and every human life as equally valuable. Um, I think that obviously extends beyond what we do as physicians. It is more than that, but it is really at the heart of this, because um, what we are instruments of justice, and as clinicians, when we have so much power as physicians. No matter what we do, if you're a respiratory therapist, you are a nurse, you are a cardiologist, you're a cardiac surgeon, we are the instruments of medical justice, and our mission is so much greater than almost anything else we do. I'll give you a small example. I have this privilege of doing work that is non-clinical, but then I also do clinical work. And every day I go to my daughter, and I'm teaching her to learn to be grateful. And so we do this thing called gratefulness diary. So she tells me something that she's grateful for. I tell her that it's something I'm grateful for, and then she says something kind that she did, and then I tell her something kind that I did. And when I'm on the non-clinical rotation, she asked me, "What is the kind thing you did?" And I really struggle sometimes. I send a nice email, or I put a smiley face at the end of this text message that I sent to someone. But when I'm doing clinical medicine,
It's easy.
it's so easy, and so I really hope and I really think that is a real wish, because in the end, so much of what we see in the world and in medicine that we feel could be better is down to the fact that not all lives, unfortunately, are treated as the same or as equal.
I would point out that your first wish was that people, you talked about access, you talked about evidence based medicine, and you talked about appropriate treatments. I think you're very cunning. You got three wishes into your first one. So good on you. Total delight speaking to you. Sadly, that is all we have time for. I really want to thank you, Dr. Haider Warraich, for being with us today, for the work that you've done thus far, and for the work that you're going to get back to as soon as we finish, because I think you're an extraordinary human being. And I hope that the next time I'm in your neck of the woods in the Northeast, that we can get together and talk in person. I've been absolutely fascinated. Please keep doing what you're doing.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you to you, EMJ, and I hope, and thank you to all the listeners for sticking it out. It's what we do, like you said, where we started. What we do is a real privilege and honor, and delighted to just be part of this wonderful community.
Absolutely. So, folks who are listening in, please subscribe so you never miss an episode. Like us on social media, tell your friends, write reviews. All that helps in driving people to this podcast so they can hear great people like today's guests. And please join us next week for another fascinating episode. Also, check out the archives. There's hordes of good stuff in there. Until then, I'm Dr. Jonathan Sacchi. I thank you for listening to the EMJ podcast. Please, everyone, stay safe, stay well, stay curious, and be kind. Bye for now.